My name is Rachel Morrow. I'm 39 years old, and for 15 years, I've been doing work I can't fully describe to my family. I gave up holidays, birthdays, Christmases, and explanations, all of it, for a career that lives behind classification walls. And for 15 years, my father called me the family disappointment. What happened at my nephew's seal pinning ceremony changed the shape of everything that came after. Have you ever spent years building something real that the people closest to you couldn't see? If so, tell me in the comments you are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand in your own truth while someone who should have known better looked straight through it, hit that like button and subscribe. What happened in that room is something I'll never forget. My mother used to say the work always speaks. You just have to wait long enough. She said it when I was 17, sitting on the back porch of our house in Savannah on a muggy August evening, while my father ran my brother through infantry small unit tactics at the picnic table just beyond the screen door. She wasn't speaking to me directly when she said it. She was looking at the middle distance, the way she said things she meant for me to carry without turning them into lessons. I was in the old wicker chair with a book I wasn't reading, and I nodded like I understood, and she didn't push, because she never pushed. She trusted me to catch up on my own schedule. It took me 20 years and a room full of Navy SEALs to understand she'd been telling me something precise. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, on March 14, 1987, the second child of Robert Morrow, Sergeant First Class, United States Army, and Linda Forsyth Morrow, who taught third grade at an elementary school a mile and a half from our house. Made the best lamb stew I have ever tasted, and held our family together with a quiet steadiness that I have spent my entire adult life trying to understand well enough to replicate. My older brother David was 5 years ahead of me and had my father's shape, not just physically but in temperament, in the way he already knew what he was before he had language for it. He went infantry. Of course he did. He went airborne, served 2 tours before he was 25, came home with the kind of posture that does not go away. He became the son my father pointed to when someone asked how the Morrow kids had turned out. I became the other answer. Not because I failed. I want to be precise about this from the very beginning, because imprecision here produces a story that isn't true. I did not fail at any point along the way. I tested high, performed well in every environment I was placed in, and was eventually selected for things I cannot discuss in this conversation. But from my father's perspective, from the vantage of a man who had built his entire sense of himself around a definition of military service that looked exactly like what he had done, I had chosen the wrong shape. Intelligence work, analytical work, desk work, he called it, though I would spend very little of my actual career behind any desk. He used that phrase in the tone of a man who is not surprised by a disappointment, as though the arc of my choices had confirmed something he already suspected, since I was old enough to be in a room and still chose the corner with a book rather than the yard with a drill. My father was not a cruel man. I need to say that and mean it. He was a particular type, the kind the Army produces in real quantity, proud, direct, self-made, deeply committed to a framework for service that had kept him whole through hard and dangerous things for 20 years. He had served in Desert Storm. He had spent 2 decades in units he loved, on operations he could name, with men he could point to. His military life had a shape he could hold and turn over and show. Mine would never give him that. And he spent 15 years not quite forgiving me for it, not with anger, but with a settled, specific disappointment that had its own particular grammar, and that was, in some ways, harder to live with than anger would have been. My mother understood something else entirely. She watched me from across rooms in the way she watched everything, with a patient, specific attention that never felt like surveillance. More like affection that had taken a careful form. She knew I was building something, though she couldn't have named what. She knew the corner of the room was not where I was hiding. It was where I was working. She never made a project of explaining this to my father. She found other ways to keep the household functional, kept dinner conversations manageable, redirected the sharpest comments before they landed, found small, specific ways across years to make sure I knew she saw me. For a long time, that was enough. She died in September of 2009. 4 months after I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. I was at Fort Huachuca in Arizona in the middle of military intelligence basic officer training when the call came at 0700 hours on a Tuesday morning. I went to my car in the parking lot and sat with the engine off for about 10 minutes doing the arithmetic of flight times. I did not go back inside to change out of my PT uniform. I booked the first available flight at the terminal counter and landed in Savannah 6 hours later. She had gone 3 hours before my plane touched the runway. I did not make it in time. I have carried that for 16 years, and I expect I will carry it for the rest of my life, which is entirely all right. Some things are worth carrying. My commissioning ceremony had been in May at the University of Georgia, under a Georgia spring sky so blue it looked painted. She was there, thinner than Christmas, but present in the full sense of the word, seated in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and a look on her face that I have spent years trying to describe accurately. After the pinning, she came to me and put both her hands on my face and held them there for a long moment without saying anything. Just looked at me. I didn't know it was the last time she would look at me that way. My father shook my hand, a correct military handshake, firm and measured. The handshake you give a peer rather than a child, which was the only form of acknowledgement he had available for that kind of moment. My brother hugged me so hard I told him to ease up. The reception cake was too sweet, and I ate 2 pieces anyway, and felt, briefly and sincerely, that everything ahead was going to be fine. 4 months later, I was standing at a grave in the September heat with no mother and a family whose center had just been removed. And my father stood in his dress greens with the rigid composure of a man trained to hold his shape under pressure. And I stood beside him and did not cry in public either. Not because I was not devastated, but because we had both learned composure at the same table. On the drive back from the cemetery, he said nothing. I said nothing. The silence between us had a weight to it that I think we both understood, somewhere below the level of words, as the beginning of something we were not going to be able to talk our way out of. I drove north toward Fort Bragg that week toward my first permanent assignment. My mother 4 months dead, my commission 3 months old, and the distance between me and my father, already beginning the long, slow extension that would define the next 15 years of our relationship. The first real deployment was Afghanistan, 2012 through 2013, Kunar province, in the mountains along the Pakistani border where the rivers run cold and fast and the operations tempo was high enough that the weeks collapsed into each other. I was working signals, intelligence collection, and analysis for a joint task force at a forward operating base, small enough that everyone knew everyone's work rhythms, but large enough to disappear into the mission cycle when you needed to. I arrived as a first lieutenant and left as a captain. I had 14 months of operational experience that I would spend the subsequent years unable to describe to my family in any meaningful way. I was good at the work. I say that plainly because it is essential to understanding what follows, not because I am interested in claiming credit I have been unable to claim in any official way. I had a particular capacity for pattern recognition under pressure, the ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously, identify the anomaly in a data set that shouldn't be there, and produce accurate analysis quickly enough for it to be actionable. These are not glamorous qualities. They do not look like much at a family dinner. My father had no language for them and no way to measure them, but they were real, and over the course of my career they would matter in ways that I cannot fully account for, because the full accounting lives behind classification walls that will outlast me. When I came back from Afghanistan in the spring of 2013, I flew into Virginia Beach for a weekend visit at David's house. My father drove up from Savannah. Karen made dinner. Ethan was 2 years old and very loud about everything. After dinner, my father poured himself coffee and sat down across from me at the kitchen table and asked what I had been doing in Afghanistan. I said signals intelligence collection, targeting support, joint task force operations. He said, "Be more specific." I said I couldn't. He looked at me over his coffee cup with the specific expression I had been seeing since childhood. Not hostile, not particularly emotional, just the quiet, settled look of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. Then he set his cup down and turned and asked David about his work, and the conversation moved on, and my career was not mentioned again for the rest of the weekend. I met Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Dunn in late 2013 at a conference room at Fort Bragg. She sat across from me and described a classified assignment in structural terms: joint environment, special operations support, real-time targeting integration. She said the work was consequential. She said I had the right profile. She said accepting the billet meant permanently losing the ability to explain my professional life to anyone outside the program, not as a side effect, but as a built-in operating condition. I said yes before she finished her sentence. I understood everything I was choosing. I understood what it would cost me in terms of legibility to my family. I made that choice fully aware, and I have never regretted it for a single day. For the next several years, I operated in classified environments across the Middle East and East Africa, building targeting packages for naval special warfare operations in real time. I cannot describe the operations. What I can tell you is what the work felt like from inside it. It felt like the difference between watching a situation develop and actually being able to shape the outcome. I was building analysis under time pressure that was sometimes measured in minutes and sometimes in seconds. I was working alongside the most capable operators in the world, and they trusted my work the way you trust a piece of equipment that has a clean, reliable record. That trust was earned, accumulated over years, and it was the most meaningful professional relationship of my life. It was also entirely invisible to my family. My father called in November 2015. He had heard from David that I was somewhere in the Middle East again. He asked where. I said I couldn't specify. He said I'd been giving that same non-answer for 2 years, and it was starting to wear on people. I said I understood. He said he didn't know what to tell people when they asked about his daughter. I said he didn't have to tell them anything. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "You know, Rachel, you were always going to be the disappointment." He said it as a statement, not a question. The tone of a man summarizing something he'd been carrying for so long that saying it out loud felt like setting it down. I told him I had to go and ended the call and sat in the dark for a while afterward. Not with grief exactly. With the specific tiredness of someone who has been holding something steady for so long, they've stopped consciously noting the effort. Those years between 2015 and 2018 were, professionally, the most demanding of my life. The work grew more complex and more consequential with each cycle. I was being integrated into operational decision chains at levels I had not expected to reach. I was working with more autonomy, more access, more accountability. I missed 4 Christmases, 3 Thanksgivings, 1 family reunion, 2 birthdays, and my nephew Ethan's first day of school. Though no one told me about that last one until years later, so perhaps it doesn't count. Each absence was another data point for my father's narrative. He was not wrong that I was missing. He was wrong about what the absence meant. He had constructed a story in which my absence was evidence of disengagement, of indifference, of a fundamental unwillingness to be a full participant in the family. The true story was that I was deployed to environments I couldn't name, doing work that I couldn't describe, on behalf of men and women who would never know my name. Those two stories could not coexist in my father's mind. He had chosen his version and was committed to it. I spent years not being able to offer him a better one. October 2018. I was 31 years old. I had been with the task force for 5 years, and I was operating at a level I had not been capable of when I started, which is how it is supposed to work and what you hope for. I don't normally attach significance to individual operations. The work is cumulative, and its meaning is distributed across years of decisions that compound in ways that are difficult to isolate from inside them. But this one clarified something. A 12-man SEAL element in the Hadramaut province of Yemen was executing the extraction of a compromised intelligence asset along a primary route that I had been monitoring for 9 months. At 22:17 local time, I was tracking the communications pattern around their route when I identified an anomaly, a specific frequency timing shift that indicated possible pre-positioning of threat elements along their primary path. Not confirmed, not certain. The kind of signal I had seen enough times in enough theaters to know what it typically preceded. The element had 48 seconds before crossing the decision point where a redirect became impossible. I called it. I redirected the element to the secondary route. The primary route was layered with explosives. Every man on that team came home. The element sergeant on the ground was a senior chief petty officer named Cal Reardon. He received the redirect call through the communications node and executed it without hesitation, which is exactly how it's supposed to work. He never met me. He didn't know my name. He knew the call sign that began attaching to me in the NSW community after that night. Moving from briefing to briefing through the specific channels in which that world communicates. Cipher 0. I found out about the call sign a year later, in a conversation I had not been expecting. A Navy lieutenant commander told me, with a formality that was both professional and personal, "Ma'am, every NSW operator who has been briefed on Yemen operations in the relevant period knows that call sign." I said thank you and went back to work. I was promoted to lieutenant colonel in the spring of 2020, below zone, at 33 years old. 13 years of commissioned service. A career that had no shape anyone outside the program could see. I called my father to tell him. He said, "Lieutenant Colonel, what does that change for you day to day?" I said, "Not much." He said, "Right." That was the promotion conversation. In 2022, another operation. I am equally unable to describe this one. What I can say is that it mattered, and that after it, the call sign Cipher 0 had spread further through the NSW community than I was aware, carried in the way that things get carried in that world. Not through formal channels, but through the organic transfer of information between men who share a specific kind of trust. In 2023, Ethan started BUD/S. The whole family gathered in Virginia Beach for a send-off dinner. My father was there. For the whole evening, I watched him with Ethan, open, luminous, proud in a way I rarely saw from him. He told stories about his own service with a warmth he almost never allowed himself. He looked at his grandson the way he had looked at David the day David pinned on his Ranger tab 20 years earlier. Watching him, I felt two things at once. I was genuinely glad for it, glad for Ethan, glad that Robert had this. And I had a thought, with a clarity that caught me off guard. My father has no idea who I am, not the person I have become, not the work I have been doing for 15 years, no idea at all. The pinning was April 15th, 2026. I drove down from a classified facility the night before, arriving at my hotel in Virginia Beach near midnight after roughly 40 hours of travel. I slept 6 hours. I put on civilian clothes, dark trousers, a gray blazer, and drove to Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay, a base I knew well from years of joint coordination. I parked and walked in and found the team room and took a seat in the back row. The ceremony itself is not elaborate. That is one of the things I have always respected about the way SEALs do it. There is no pageant. The trident is pinned by the class chief, brief and precise. The element sergeant says the few words that need saying. Then the family is invited forward. Ethan's wife, Sarah, pinned the left side of his trident. My father was given the honor of pinning the right. I watched my father's hands as he leaned in to do it, careful, deliberate. A soldier's hands that knew the weight of what they were placing. He was 70 years old. I had not seen him that fully present in a very long time. Whatever else was true about the day, I thought this moment was real and good. I was glad I was in the room for it. The reception opened up afterward, folding tables with food, the low, comfortable energy of a group of professionals who know how to be off-duty without losing their shape. I got a plate and found a spot against the far wall where I could see the room without being in the center of it. I was tired and not looking for conversation. I was watching Ethan work the room, man after man coming to him, welcoming him in with the specific economy that operators use for things they mean. In his posture, I could see him absorbing all of it, the weight of what he'd earned, and I was proud of him in a way that didn't need words. My father was near the center of the room with David, animated, telling a story, a beer in his hand, his voice warm with the ease of a man who is comfortable in a room full of military men. Karen was somewhere behind me talking to Ethan's wife. I wasn't watching my father. I was watching Ethan. I don't know exactly when Robert spotted me. I know his voice carried farther than he intended, the way voices carry when a man is comfortable and not measuring his volume. He leaned toward David and moved his chin in my direction and said, "That one's always been the disappointment, never could get herself together." David looked at the floor. Senior Chief Petty Officer Cal Reardon was standing 3 rows away from me, mid-conversation with a young petty officer. He stopped mid-sentence. He turned. He was 38 years old, 15 years of operational service, a man who had spent his career in environments where reading a room accurately was not optional. He looked at my face. He was completely still. Something in his memory engaged. A pre-mission briefing. Hadramaut, Province. October 2018. An authentication photograph in the targeting file. A face he had seen once, in a classified document, 8 years ago. The face of the officer whose call had brought his team home. He looked at my face and he was certain. He leaned toward Petty Officer First Class Jake Mercer beside him and said 2 words so quietly I could not hear them from across the room. Mercer's fork went still. He turned. He had been on the Syria operation in 2022. He had been briefed on Cipher 0. He knew exactly what those 2 words meant, and he knew the face they were attaching to. He turned to the man on his other side. I watched the first man turn, then the second. I did not understand what I was seeing for approximately 4 seconds. Then I did. I kept my face completely still. I have had years of practice. The recognition moved through the room the way information moves in a unit, not with heat, the way gossip does, but with precision, the way a field report does. 1 man to the next, specific and certain, 3 operators near the food table, an instructor near the door, the team officer by the window. Within 90 seconds, every SEAL in that team room, 22 of them, drinks in their hands, was facing the back wall. Facing me. 22 operators who had been briefed, in one context or another, on the targeting officer whose work had shaped operations across 3 combat theaters. The woman their families didn't know. The woman standing quietly against the back wall at a pinning ceremony for her nephew, while her father stood 20 feet away with his beer, telling anyone who listened that she'd never amounted to anything. My father noticed. He was a trained soldier, and situational awareness was not something he had to consciously activate. He tracked the direction the room had oriented to. He found the point they were all facing. He looked at me. He stood with his beer and tried to build a story that accounted for what he was seeing, and the pieces would not assemble into anything that fit the narrative he had been carrying for 15 years. I could see him trying. I could see him unable to get there. Nobody explained it to him. I looked back at the room. I did not nod or speak or give them anything except my stillness. The stillness of a woman who had spent 20 years becoming exactly who she was, in rooms no one would ever read about, and who had, finally, stopped needing to translate herself for people who weren't cleared to receive the full version. Ethan found me in the parking lot. He had looked for me inside the team room and not found me, then came out and crossed the lot in his dress uniform, trident, newly pinned, and sat beside me on the hood of my rental car without asking if that was all right. That was fine. That's how we are with each other. We looked at the evening sky for a while. He said, "I saw the room turn. What was that?" I said, "Some of those guys know some of the work I've done." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I figured something like that." He didn't push for more. He was an operator now. He knew the shape of what he'd been told, and he was smart enough not to reach past it. We talked about the ceremony and his assignment and the work up ahead. The April evening was warm. The parking lot sounds drifted in from across the base. It was, in the way of certain hours that only become clear in retrospect, one of the better ones I can name from that stretch of my life. I drove back to my hotel and sat at the desk with a glass of water. The quiet was different from my usual quiet, not empty. More like the quiet of something that has found its right place after a long time of not quite fitting. I thought about my mother on the back porch in Savannah 22 years ago, looking at the middle distance, saying the work always speaks. I thought about what she would have made of 22 Navy SEALs turning in a team room at her daughter's call sign. She would have laughed. A warm laugh, not triumphant, the kind that says without words, "I told you." She was right. She was right about everything that mattered. In the days after the pinning, I turned some things over carefully. My father's words had not wounded me in any new way. I was past new wounds from that direction, had been for years. What I was sitting with was something else. The particular quality of the room. 22 operators with the freedom to walk out to any corner of the world, and they had all, without a word from me, turned to face the woman their fathers would have called a disappointment to. Not because they had to, not because someone instructed them to, because the work had its own record, and the record had its own gravity, and neither of those things had ever required my father's understanding to be real. Back at work, the following Monday, I ran a training exercise, a joint targeting scenario at a classified facility. Running through historical case studies with a new group of officers, mostly captains and majors in their late 20s and early 30s, people at the beginning of the arc I had been on for 15 years. I didn't tell them which operations the case studies were drawn from. I just walked through the mechanics. Afterward, a young captain from the 82nd Airborne came up and asked, "Ma'am, were you involved in any of the operations in the case study?" I said, "Some of them." He nodded. He already suspected. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and walked away, and that was exactly the right amount of acknowledgement. On the drive home that evening, I thought about what it had cost me to be good at this work for 15 years in invisible rooms, and I found, turning it over carefully, that the cost had been exactly right. I had given what the work required. The work had given back in the only currency that matters, which is not visibility or recognition or a father's approval, but the specific knowledge that when the moment came, you made the right call, and the right people came home because of it. That is the whole account. Everything else is annotation. The weeks after the pinning, I made some decisions. I stopped taking my father's calls out of obligation and started answering when I had something I wanted to say. I stopped constructing apologies for my absences and started showing up on my own terms, in the spaces I chose, without preemptively managing the gap between what I was and what he could see. These sound like small decisions. They weren't small, not from the inside. For 15 years, I had been managing that gap, answering every call, building every bridge, arriving at every gathering with a story prepared about why I couldn't say more. I was done with that. The pinning hadn't changed what my father thought of me, but it had clarified with the precision of a room full of SEALs turning in formation that the people who needed to know who I was already knew. That was enough. That had always been enough. Lunch with David in Virginia Beach a few weeks later. Just the two of us, first time in 4 years. He ordered a burger and looked at the water, and after a while he said, "He's been quieter since the pinning. Working something out, I think." I said I'd noticed through the calls. David was quiet for a moment and then said, "I should have pushed back more over the years. I didn't." First time he had said it plainly without qualification. I told him I didn't need him to have done it. I needed him to understand what it had cost, which was different from needing him to have intervened. He said, "I know." I believed him without reservation. That lunch was one of the better hours I've had with my brother, not because anything was resolved, but because we were both, finally, telling true things. My father pushed David for an explanation of what had happened at the reception. David said, "She does important work. A lot of people know who she is." Robert asked what that meant. David said, "I think it means exactly what you saw." My father was quiet for a long time, and then said it had been unprofessional for those men to stand around staring at a woman that way. David said, clearly, with a steadiness I hadn't heard from him before on this subject, "Dad, they knew her." My father ended the call. David told me about it the next day. I sat with it for a moment and then let it go. My father was 70 years old with a fixed architecture for understanding what service looked like. The revision was going to take time. I had stopped waiting on it. In early June, my Aunt Margaret called. Robert's older sister, retired now, who had known me my whole life. She said she'd heard something had happened at the pinning. I said something had. She said, "I don't know exactly what it was, but I want you to know that your father has been wrong about how he treated you. Has been for a long time. I should have said it sooner." I thanked her. I didn't say much else. When I hung up, I sat for a moment with the weight of what she'd said, landing in a place I hadn't known was still open to receive it. 15 years of the family's private version of events. Someone in that generation finally saying plainly, "That was wrong. I had not needed it." But some part of me had apparently been carrying it anyway. And hearing it said out loud, release something I hadn't known was being held. I told David about the call. He said he was glad she'd done it. He said he should have done it himself. I told him it was all right. And I meant it. The ledger of that relationship had been complicated for a long time, and what we were doing now, the honest conversations, the real ones, the ones where we stopped covering for the story that had been told for 15 years, That was worth more than any retroactive intervention could have been. Ethan left for his first workup in July. He called the night before he shipped out and we talked for about an hour. At the end, he said, "I'm going to do good work." I said, "I know you will." He asked if he'd ever get to understand what I did. I said, "Some of it, not now. Maybe later." He said that was fine, and I believed him, because that is the kind of man he was becoming. Patient with things he couldn't know yet, trusting the shape of the information he had been given. I told him, "Do the work, trust the work is everything." When I hung up, I stood at my kitchen window for a while, watching the evening light change over the rooftops, thinking about the things we say to other people that turn out to be the things we most needed to keep telling ourselves. The other decision I made in those weeks was simpler and took longer to name. I stopped performing the version of myself that was calibrated for my father's line of sight. Not dramatically, I didn't announce it, didn't make it a confrontation. I just stopped. I stopped arriving at family conversations with a practiced set of deflections for the questions about my work. I stopped manufacturing the apologetic tone that said, "I know you don't understand this. I'm sorry I can't explain it." I just answered directly in the plainest terms available and let the limits of what I could say be where they were without apologizing for them. Sounds straightforward. It was not. 15 years of a habit runs deep. But I had found, in the particular quality of those 90 seconds in the team room, a kind of bedrock I hadn't known I was still looking for. And from bedrock, you can stand up straight. My work through that spring and summer was good. The task force had new personnel to integrate and new operational cycles to run, and the kind of problems that required exactly the skills I had spent 15 years developing. I was productive in the specific way of someone who has stopped spending any internal bandwidth on the question of whether the work is worth doing. It was worth doing, it always had been. I was just finally wholly available to it. Midsummer, my Aunt Margaret's call had opened something in the family's circuitry that had been stuck for a long time. I could feel the change without being able to describe it precisely. Something in the way David talked to Robert on the phone. Something in the way Robert's voicemails sounded when he left them for me. Less settled, more tentative. The story he had been telling himself for 15 years had developed a fracture, and light was getting in through it in small, specific ways that I was not sure he knew how to manage. Ethan, newly assigned to Team 4 at Little Creek, passed Senior Chief Reardon in a passageway on base in mid-June. He texted me about it that evening. He said Reardon had stopped him and asked how his family was doing. And when Ethan said everyone was well, Reardon had said, "Tell your aunt she did good work." Ethan said he had no idea what to say to that. He said, "Is that normal?" I texted back. "Yes," he texted. "Okay." He understood the economy of it even if he didn't have the context. He was learning the language. I went back to Savannah in September. No occasion, no holiday. On my own terms, I just drove down for a long weekend and stayed at David's and saw my father on a Saturday afternoon. We sat on the back porch of the house where I grew up with coffee going warm between our hands, and the September heat was still enough to notice, and we didn't say very much at all. He asked about Virginia Beach. He asked about Ethan's assignment. He did not ask about my work, and I understood by then that he had concluded, somewhere in the summer, that asking would not change the answer, and that not being able to see the work did not mean the work wasn't real. He looked at me differently that afternoon than he had at any point in my adult life. Not with pride, not quite. With the particular expression of a man who has been wrong about something for a very long time and is deciding how to inhabit the revision. We sat on that porch for about an hour. He told me a story about his time in Kuwait that I had never heard, a long story, detailed, about a night in the desert when a truck broke down and how they fixed it, and what the sky looked like, and the name of the man who stayed up with him until 3 a.m. making the repair. I listened to the whole thing. I didn't rush it. It was a good story. He had been a good soldier. I had always known that. When it was over, I said, "That was a good one." He said, "Yeah, it was." We stayed on the phone a minute longer than we needed to. Then he went inside, and I drove back to David's and sat on the steps of the front porch in the late afternoon, watching the neighborhood and feeling, in a way I had not felt in a very long time, that something in the architecture of the family had shifted into a form I could live with. The porch in September deserves more than a paragraph. I had not sat on that porch since my mother died. I had been to Savannah since David's house, holiday dinners at Margaret's, but not to this house, not to this porch, not to the specific green chair in the corner where my mother used to sit on summer evenings with a book and a glass of iced tea. The house had passed to Robert, and he had kept it, and the porch was largely unchanged except for the chairs, which had been replaced at some point with different ones. I sat in the chair closest to the door. My father sat in the one nearest the railing. We drank our coffee, and the September heat held on, and the neighborhood sounds came in from around us. A lawnmower, 2 houses down, a dog, children somewhere in the distance. My father told me the story about Kuwait, about the truck and the night and the man who stayed up with him to make the repair. I had never heard it. In 20 years of family dinners, that story had never come up. I don't know why he told it to me then. I think he was trying to offer something he could offer. He couldn't offer access to what I did. He couldn't offer the understanding he'd denied me for 15 years. What he could offer was that story, something true, from his own service, a thing that mattered to him. I think it was the closest he knew how to get to saying, "I see you did something real. I did something real too. I received it the way it was meant. That is all." Ethan came home from his workup in October. He spent a weekend at my place in Virginia, the first time he'd stayed with me in about 4 years. We cooked. I made his grandmother's lamb stew from memory, the third time I'd ever attempted it, and it was the best version yet. He was quiet in the way of new operators returning from a first workup, processing, settling, finding the new equilibrium. I asked if the work was what he'd expected. He said, "More specific than I thought, more personal." I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. The abstraction you carry in training, the idea of the work, is replaced by the specific and irreducible reality of it, and the two are related, but they are not the same thing. You adjust. You find the person you actually are in the work, as opposed to the person you thought you'd be. It takes time, and it is good when it happens. He asked quietly, over his second bowl of stew, whether the SEALs at his pinning had really known me. I said some of them had. He said, "Senior Chief Reardon." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment and then nodded like a man filing information. He didn't ask for more. He was learning, as all operators learn, the exact dimensions of what he was entitled to know, and that the dimensions of that were sometimes smaller than curiosity and larger than nothing. There is a thing that happens in families when a story that has been load-bearing for a long time begins to be revised. The revision doesn't happen cleanly. It happens in pieces, around the edges, in the small daily moments where the old story no longer fits the available evidence and has to be adjusted. My father was going through that revision. I watched it from a distance, through what David told me, through what Ethan mentioned, through the specific quality of the messages my father left when he called. The confidence was gone from them, not the confidence of a man who is wrong and knows it, but the confidence of a man who has been certain for so long that uncertainty is disorienting. He was working something out. It was going to take the time it took. What I could do, and what I focused on, was showing up in the spaces I chose to show up in, fully and cleanly, without the old protective armor. The family dinner in September, the calls with David, the long evening with Ethan and his lamb stew, these things mattered independently of whether my father arrived at the right understanding. They mattered because they were mine, and because the people in them were people I genuinely loved, and because I had spent too many years allowing his version of me to shape how I showed up in all my other relationships. November. Orders. A joint command-level targeting integration billet, the assignment I had been working toward for 3 years, the kind of position that represented the full extension of the career I'd been building since Patricia Dunn sat down across from me in that Fort Bragg conference room 11 years ago. I read them on a Tuesday morning in my office with a cup of coffee and felt no surprise, just the clean forward feeling of the next thing arriving when it was supposed to. I texted David, "Got new orders. Gone for a bit." He replied within 2 minutes, "Be safe." I texted Ethan, "New billet. Go time." He replied, "Who do I thank?" I smiled at my phone. I wrote back, "Nobody. Just do good work." He replied, "Yes, ma'am." The first time he had ever called me ma'am in a message. I noticed it. I called my father that evening to tell him I was deploying. He asked how long. I said I didn't know exactly. There was a pause on his end, a specific kind of pause, not empty but occupied. the pause of a man working something out in real time. Then he said, "Be careful, Rachel." I want to be precise about what those 2 words meant after 39 years of their absence. My father was a man who expressed care through duty rather than words. He had shaken my hand at my commissioning. He had asked whether I was doing something important and said good when I said yes. He had told me a story about a broken truck in Kuwait that I understood was a form of offering. These were the currencies he had available, and he had used them. But he had never said those 2 words to me. Not once. Not in all of it. I said, "Always." I hung up and took out the small notebook I keep in my kit, and I wrote the date, and I wrote, "Be careful," and I set the notebook back in the front pocket. I wanted to have it somewhere I could find it. The night before I shipped out, I wrote a letter to my mother. By hand, sitting at the kitchen table at 11 at night with a glass of water and the apartment very quiet. I've written 3 letters to her in my life, and this was the 3rd. I told her about the pinning. I told her about the room turning. I told her about my father saying, "Be careful," for the first time. I told her about the work, not the operations, just the feeling of it. What it feels like to do something that matters for 20 years in rooms that will never be described to anyone, and to have the right people. Finally, no. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the front pocket of my deployment kit, behind the notebook. I didn't plan to open it again. I just wanted it with me. I wanted to carry it the way she carried things, quietly, over the long distance, without making a production of the weight. There is a particular quality to the night before a deployment that I have experienced enough times to have given it a name in my own private taxonomy. I call it the clear night. Everything feels very specific and precise. The objects in your apartment, the sounds of the building settling, the weight of your kit packed and ready by the door. Your senses are calibrated in a particular way. You notice things you normally pass by, the pattern of the ceiling, the exact sound of the refrigerator's hum, the texture of the notebook in your hand. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter to my mother with a pen I'd had for 10 years, a fine point ballpoint that I keep in my kit and have kept replacing when the ink runs out. I wrote for about 40 minutes without stopping, which is unusual for me. I am not a person who writes easily, in the way that some people write easily, with the words flowing before the thinking catches up. I write slowly and I choose words carefully, but that night the letter came out the way things come out on clear nights. Very specific, very precise, without much need for revision. I told her what I needed to tell her. I folded it 3 times and put it in the front pocket of the kit and pressed my hand against the outside of the pocket for a moment, which is not something I would normally do and which I am not going to explain further. I packed my kit in the last quiet hour before departure. Among the things I packed, the deployment kit, the classified documentation, the work notebook, the letter, and the ring, the tungsten band given to me by Cal Riordan's team after the Yemen operation, in a small room in a facility that appears in no official record. A challenge coin in ring form, engraved with a designation I am not authorized to name. I had never worn it publicly. I carried it in my kit. It was the thing that had connected a room full of strangers to a name they knew from a different kind of room, and I wanted it where I could put my hand on it if I needed to. I drove out of Virginia in the pre-dawn dark at 0400, the highway empty, and the sky not yet light, the kind of departure I had made many times, and that was still, every time, its own thing. I drove south through the first hour of it, and then the highway curved away from the coast, and the sky began to lighten, and I was going somewhere I could not name, to do work I would not be able to describe to my family, the same as it had always been. And for the first time in 15 years, that felt entirely, precisely right. The deployment was 6 months. I cannot tell you the country. I cannot tell you the operations. I can tell you that the work was what it has always been, specific, urgent, consequential, and invisible to everyone outside the rooms where it happens. I can tell you that on a night approximately 2 months into the deployment, a joint element was redirected based on my real-time analysis of an anomalous threat signature, and that 7 men came home from that night who might not have otherwise. I filed my report and moved to the next operational cycle. That is how it is supposed to work. The work carries itself. What I can tell you is what it felt like in the intervals between operations, in the specific compressed quiet of a classified work environment where the days have weight and the nights have weight, and you learn very quickly which people around you are solid and which are not. I was surrounded, as I always am in these environments, by solid people. People who showed up to the work fully, who asked the right questions and trusted the answers they received, and pushed back when they should, and didn't push back when they shouldn't. Working alongside people like that is its own form of sustenance. It always has been. I thought about my father sometimes in those intervals. Not with the old heaviness, with something more like the equanimity you develop when you have finally stopped trying to control an outcome you cannot control. He was 70 years old. He had built his identity around a definition of service that had nothing to do with what I did. And revising that definition at 70 was a different kind of work than revising it at 30 or 40 would have been. I did not expect it to happen quickly. I did not need it to happen at all. What I needed, what I had found, finally, at the pinning and in the months after, was the quiet certainty that the work was real, that the right people knew it was real, and that my father's inability to see it did not diminish it in any way. I thought about Ethan, about the coin on the diner table, about the way he'd said he figured something like that, about the room turning and then didn't push. He was going to be very good. I had known that for years. He had the particular quality that the best operators have, which is not aggression or even exceptional physical capacity, though he had those, but a specific kind of patience, the willingness to wait for the right information before acting, to trust that the intelligence would come and to be ready for it when it did. He had that from the beginning, and it was going to serve him for the rest of his career. I thought about the letter in my kit. I did not open it, I just knew it was there, folded in the front pocket behind the notebook, and that my mother had been right about the things she'd said on the back porch when I was 17. The work does speak. It speaks in its own time, in its own register, to the people who are equipped to hear it. Not everyone will be. That is all right. That has always been all right. I came home in April of 2027, 40 years old. Landed at Dulles in civilian clothes in the early morning, same as I always land, nothing announcing what I'd been doing for 6 months. My phone reconnected in the terminal and filled with messages. I read them on the shuttle bus, David, Ethan, Margaret, a few colleagues, and then put the phone away and watched Virginia go past the window. Coming home is never quite what you expect. It's quieter than the word suggests, more like a pressure releasing that you had stopped noticing you were carrying. The quality of the light on the Virginia countryside felt very specifically like something I had missed, though I hadn't consciously known I was missing it. I had 2 days before I needed to report back. I slept 9 hours, which I almost never do. I made coffee the way I wanted it. I sat at my kitchen table in the morning light and did not open my work phone for 4 hours, which is as close as I come to a vacation. On the second day, I drove to Virginia Beach. Ethan met me at a diner he liked on the Virginia Beach waterfront, a place with good pie and booths along the window, and the kind of waitstaff who refill your coffee without asking. He'd been back from his first deployment for 6 weeks. He looked different, not older exactly, more settled, more fully himself. There is a version of you that exists before your first real deployment, and a version that exists after, and the after version is more specific, more certain of what you can do and what you cannot, and what you are willing to do when the moment requires it. He had found the after version, and it fit him well. We ordered too much food and stayed for 3 hours. We talked about a road trip he wanted to take up the Pacific coast in the fall. We talked about a movie he'd seen 3 times in the past month and couldn't entirely explain why. We talked about his grandmother's lamb stew and when I was going to make it again. We talked about a book he was reading. We talked about his wife, who was pregnant with their first child, which I had known for 2 months and had been very careful not to mention before he was ready to announce it himself. When he told me across that table, watching my face, I felt something that I suspect is a version of what my father felt at the pinning. That particular specific pride that attaches to the moment when someone you love becomes fully, irreversibly themselves. Near the end of the meal, without preamble, he reached into his jacket pocket and slid something across the table toward me. A challenge coin, his team's insignia on one side, a unit motto I am not authorized to repeat on the other. Heavy, clean, the kind of coin that means what it means because of the specific people who give them and receive them. He said, "I figured you should have one from our side." I picked it up. I turned it over in my fingers. Same weight as mine, different design, same meaning underneath everything. The diner in Virginia Beach was the right place for that meal. Not because of anything specific about the diner itself, it was a competent diner with adequate pie and good coffee, but because of what a diner is, which is a place where the stakes are low and the time is your own, and nobody needs anything from you except to order when the waitress comes around. After 6 months in a classified environment where everything is urgent and consequential and load-bearing, a diner where the only decision is whether to get the cherry or the pecan is its own form of medicine. We ate slowly. We didn't rush anything. Ethan told me about a moment during his deployment that he was able to share, not the classified elements, just a thing that had happened with the men on his team that had made him understand something about the work he hadn't understood in training. I listened. I recognized the thing he was describing. I had felt it myself, in different contexts, a dozen times. The moment when the abstraction becomes real and what was a concept becomes a fact you carry in your body. He was going to be good at this for a long time. I could already see the arc of it. When he put the coin on the table and said he figured I should have one from their side, I held it for a long time before I put it in my pocket. I was thinking about the first coin, about Cal Reardon's team in a room in a facility with no official record, giving me something that meant, you were here, you did this, we know. And now Ethan's coin, you are family, you are ours, we know. Same weight, different languages, same thing underneath. I put it in my jacket pocket, next to the one I'd been carrying for 8 years, and we paid the bill and walked out into the April afternoon. I was driving north on the coast road, windows down, the Chesapeake on my left going silver-gray in the late afternoon light, when my father's name appeared on my phone, mounted on the dashboard. I looked at it for one ring, which is the amount of time it used to take me to decide whether to answer. Now, it was the amount of time I needed to reach over and pick up. He asked if I was back. I said I was. He said, "Good." I smiled at the road. We talked for about 20 minutes. He told me about a friend from his old unit who had passed away in February, a man I'd met once when I was a teenager. He talked about the funeral and the people who'd come, and how it was strange to be at the age where those gatherings happened more often than the other kind. I listened. I didn't fill the silences. He didn't need me to fill them. When the signal started going patchy near the bend where the trees close in over the highway, I let the call end naturally. I didn't try to fix the connection. We said goodbye, and the call dropped, and that was exactly right. I parked outside my building with the engine off and the windows down and the April evening coming in. 2 coins in my jacket pocket, same weight, one from each side of the work. A letter in my kit that I would read someday, when the time felt right. A notebook with a date and 2 words in it. A father who had said, "Be careful," for the first time in 39 years, and a brother who was finally telling the truth, and a nephew who had given me a coin from his side. I thought about my mother on the back porch in Savannah 22 years ago, looking at the middle distance, saying the things she knew I wasn't ready to fully hear. The work always speaks. You just have to wait long enough. She was right. She was right about all of it, and I wish she had been alive to see it, and I think in some way she was. If you have spent years making yourself smaller for someone who still could not see you, I want you to hear this. The right people know. The work carries itself. You do not have to prove anything to anyone who is not worth the proof. You just have to keep going, keep doing the work that is yours to do, keep showing up with the whole of what you are, and trusting that the room will eventually turn, because it will. One day, in a room you didn't plan to be in, every head will turn. That is enough. That has always, always been enough. I dropped both coins in my jacket pocket, got out of the car, and went inside. 22 SEALs turned around in that room because the work was real. My father didn't understand what he was seeing, and honestly, I'm not sure he needed to. What I know is that I stopped waiting for him to see it, and that was the thing that changed everything. If you've ever had someone in your family call you the disappointment, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. And if this story hits something real for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every day I'm sharing stories about what it looks like to build something that matters, even when the people closest to you can't see it yet. I'll see you in the next one.